Welcome to our second master conference. We're going to have Professor Ioanna Marinescu presenting something called Big Data and the Labor Market. I'm going to introduce Ioanna Marinescu. She's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her research expertise includes antitrust and labor market, the universal basic income, unemployment insurance, and employment contracts. She has testified for policymakers, including the Federal Trade Commission, and has briefed congressional staff. Her work has been cited in many media outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and The Economist. You can follow her on Twitter.
There.
You can see that.
I am Ioanna.
Ioanna. Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Ioanna. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be back in Mexico after a few years where I was here to present my work on the labor market impacts of Seguro Popular. So today we're talking about yet other labor market topics using big data. Just by way of introduction, we've seen already so far many examples of the use of big data, and I think it was so very useful to have these examples from the keynote yesterday and today from the people from the statistical offices. As a researcher, I'm also interested in, everybody talks about big data, what is it? And especially I'm going to take here the angle of the researcher. For us researchers, what does it mean? What are the advantages of big data? So one way to think about big data is to think that big data is a bit like the exhaust pipe of our lives. Like when you drive, necessarily you're gonna leave behind smoke. So when you live nowadays more and more, anything you do is data. Anything you do, sensors, we talked about sensors, it leaves a trace. And so the art of big data for research is how to exploit that in order to gain new insights about many issues. As a labor economist, I'm especially interested in labor market issues. So there are two main types of big data, which is administrative data. So this is usually collected for the purpose of government operations, different government programs. So a key example for me as a labor economist is unemployment insurance data. And then you also have a lot of other data sources, but one big category is data from online activities. Nowadays, more and more services and businesses are conducted online. And for the purpose of understanding the labor market, one big source is going to be online job boards where people look at jobs and apply for jobs. And so that's going to yield new insights into the functioning of the labor market. So what's up with big data? Like, why do we like it so much? And again, here I'm going to take the perspective of the researcher. So there's two main things that are great about big data in general. Usually it has more variables or more details than some of the surveys. Not always, depends what data we're talking about, but oftentimes there's more details. So for example, in traditional labor market surveys, you don't have data on each job application that a job seeker sends. The job seeker, in order to measure unemployment, one of the definitions of being unemployed is looking for a job. So we will ask in a survey, are you looking? Yes. But then we don't know, what job you applied to, any details about your search. So thanks to big data, we'll be able to use actual job applications that people send to different jobs. The second characteristic is oftentimes you get more observations. So, for the stats nerds here, the first one, more variables, means you have a wider data set, and more observations, you have a longer data set. So you can get, for example, instead of just having a sample, you can get the population, say the data on all employees' wages from administrative records. So those are key characteristics of big data. I will say, interestingly, that usually this kind of administrative data is pretty narrow. It doesn't have a lot of variables. It might have everybody, But usually, if we just rely on administrative data, we don't have a lot of information. There's a limited number of variables that are collected on people. So today, my purpose is to talk to you about a number of my research papers that have used, so we're moving a bit from how do you make big data to how do you use big data for research, and some of the insights that we've been able to gain from the use of big data within labor economics. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 different topics today. So each one of them is going to be a bit, high level. So the first one, I'm going to talk to you about how matching occurs between workers and firms. So how do we go from a worker looking for a job, a firm looking for a worker, to an actual job being formed. And second, I'm going to talk to you about the impact of unemployment insurance. And then the third and fourth point are going to be about competition in the labor market and how this affects wages, and then the implications for policy, in particular the minimum wage. All right, so the first part is about matching workers and firms. So in this paper called Opening the Black Box of the Matching Function, the Power of Words, it's been published in the Journal of Labor Economics with my co-author Ronald Waldhoff. So what we do in this paper is we use data from the largest online job board in the US, which is careerbuilder.com. It has about a third of all US jobs. And we want to answer 2 basic questions that weren't really answered before for lack of data. How exactly do firms advertise their jobs? And 2, how do workers decide which jobs they want to apply to? And the key takeaway from the paper is that job titles, something like administrative assistant or director of accounting or director of statistics, this is a key way in which employers advertise a job. It's one of the most important job characteristics, as well as a key way in which workers decide what jobs to apply to. They decide very much based on the job title. Comparably speaking, as I will show you, wages are not as important. Certainly in the first stages of workers and firms getting together, getting to know each other, this job title, so to speak, is the key signal that they coordinate on. It's really about the job title. That's how we communicate, at least in the beginning, about what the job is. And so I'm going to show you some evidence about this right now. So rolling back in economic theory, just before I show you a big table of results, we have wondered about this question in economic theory. And the answer usually is, well, what's important is wages. Simple model will say employers advertise a wage and then people decide to apply based on the wage, okay? If that's the case, you would expect that higher wage jobs receive more applications, right? That's the whole point of advertising higher wages. So the first table I'm going to show you tests if in general in the data that's true. So what we find in this first column of results there, this shows you the impact of the wage that employers advertise, the posted wage, on how many applications the job gets. This negative sign that you see there in this first column shows that higher wage jobs in general, and in this regression I don't control for anything, just in the economy in general, the higher the wage, the fewer applicants a job gets. It's an extremely strong pattern that generally speaking, higher wage jobs in the economy get fewer, not more applicants. Now you might say, well, of course, jobs are different, so you can't really compare, an accountant with a house cleaner, so maybe we should control for the type of job. So if we use our standard statistical categories, which is the occupational category, this is what I do in the second column. I control for SOC, Standard Occupational Code classification. At the 6-digit level, this is about 800 types of occupations that the statistical agencies in the US use to classify jobs. That doesn't help. Even within accounting jobs, higher paying accounting jobs get systematically fewer applicants than lower paying accounting jobs. And so it's only when I control in column 4 here for job titles that you get finally that higher paying jobs get more applicants. So what's the job title here? It's going to be something like junior accountant or senior accountant or director of accounting. This is critical. If you don't account for this very specific type of job, you get this pattern where high-wage jobs tend to get fewer applicants, which is very paradoxical and not what you would expect. So just to illustrate with some nice word clouds, I want to show you what's going on here intuitively. So in the upper two clouds, you see the words in the job title that are associated with lower wage. And these are words in the job title within an occupational category. So this is all among accounting jobs. If you have these sort of words, it predicts lower pay. So a key example is going to be assistant. Right? So assistant, if you see assistant in a job, it predicts systematically lower pay. And it's big because it's a very common word. And then if you look at the correlation between application and the words, you see again assistant coming up. That assistant means you get a lot more applications for a job that is assistant, but at the same time it pays lower wages. The lower clouds show you the opposite. So you can see that manager is a common word associated with higher wages within a job type, but it's also a word that predicts systematically fewer applications. So these are the kinds of details that the standard occupational classification doesn't capture. For example, I told you about accounting. You see, if you're a staff accountant, you don't manage. But if you're a director of accounting or accounting manager, that's also an accountant, is a manager. It's going to pay more and get fewer applicants. So this really shows you, the lesson from this is you need the granularity of big data to derive a result that seems intuitive, which is that higher paying jobs should get more applicants. So then to conclude from this paper, we showed that there is substantial heterogeneity across jobs. Even within a detailed occupational category, we find that more senior jobs pay higher wages, yet attract fewer applicants. And so if you fix the job title, you consider, for example, director of accounting. Well, within director of accounting, you find that jobs with 10% higher wages attract about 7 to 8% more applicants, again, once we fix the job title, something like Director of Accounting. So to summarize then from this research, we find that job titles are important to understand the extent of the labor market that a worker searches in and how sensitive workers are to wages. And you'll see in a subsequent paper how this becomes very important. All right, second, let's talk about policy. So this first paper was very descriptive. There isn't necessarily an immediate policy implication. It's just showing you how people search for jobs and how firms advertise. Now I want to talk to you about policy, namely unemployment insurance, and trying to understand how unemployment insurance affects people's job search activity. Okay? So what we do here, and this is a working paper with Daphne Skandalis, is we ask the question, how does unemployment insurance duration affect job applications and job finding? So the basic idea here is that economic theory predicts that if you give people more months of unemployment insurance, they will take longer to find a job. But we want to know, why is that? So that's our big question is, well, why is it, and that's sort of well known in the literature, that when you give people longer benefits, let's say you give them a year of unemployment insurance instead of 6 months, they take longer to find a job. Really, why is that? So we ask two questions more specifically. What is the margin? Is it search intensity, namely that if you give people more unemployment insurance, they are getting, lazy, they search less, so they're taking it easy? Or is it the reservation wage, meaning that if you get people more generous unemployment insurance, now they become very demanding, very picky. They want only a high wage. And of course, it takes longer to find a high wage job, so that would also mean that they're going to stay unemployed for longer. And the second question is unemployment insurance influencing people throughout? So is it that already from day one of their unemployment spell, they're already searching less and maybe being more demanding? Or does it only have an effect later on around benefits exhaustion? So once they are about to lose their benefits, maybe that's when the behavior is different. So what do we do? So this is a big data conference. So here, instead of using online data, I actually use a combination of administrative unemployment insurance records, so from the administrative records of who receives unemployment insurance, together with online job search data in France, and we're able to match those two data sources, in particular because this is the job search engine that is the public job search engine. So we're able to match the administrative data with the online job search. And we are able to follow an individual over time, so we can see how they react. And how do we derive the effects? Essentially, we make use of the fact that in France, every duration exists. There's people who get 1 month of unemployment insurance up to 36 months. So by comparing all these different cases, we can get a handle on why is it that people who get longer benefits take longer to find a job. And the main answer is because they send fewer applications. So, and these two graphs exemplify that. So again, why is it that people with longer unemployment benefits take longer to find a job? It's because they send fewer applications. And furthermore, the key thing is that this is happening at exhaustion. So in the month that they lose their benefits, that's where the action is, or a few months before. So this graph here shows you in different colors the patterns of job applications for people who are entitled to 6 months of benefits, 12 months, etc. So what you can see is that every time there is a spike in applications, exactly in the month and sort of just right before. So people are panicking. They're like, oh my God, I am going to lose my benefits. So now I'm going to apply to many more jobs in order to avoid ending up with no benefits. And you can see on the right-hand side, this is from the administrative data, the exit to jobs. So what's the probability of finding a job? It spikes exactly around benefit exhaustion. So it's something that we can control for more things and so on, but the raw data gives you the answer. Again, the main reason why unemployment insurance leads to longer unemployment duration is that people delay this huge increase in job search. The further away you put it, and the more people will delay increasing their job search until the month of exhaustion. I do want to note, though, that practically speaking, there are relatively few people who go there. A lot of people exit here. So, it doesn't necessarily affect a lot of people, but those who are still unemployed, they really react to the loss of their benefits. So, what's important here is that from a policy standpoint, on the one hand, you could say, oh, that's terrible. It means unemployment insurance is bad. It puts this bad incentives for people to delay searching. But what we show in the paper is that finding a job is very hard. Every application you send has a very low probability of converting into a job. So at the same time, our paper justifies unemployment insurance by showing that people need time to search, that you cannot find a job immediately. So yes, unemployment insurance distorts the timing of how you search, but yet you need unemployment insurance because jobs are hard to find. Even if you apply, the probability that you're going to get the job is very low. So, you have to hold in your head these two aspects of unemployment insurance. All right, so that was for unemployment insurance. Next up, I want to talk to you about labor market concentration. So the first part is going to be, just like in the first two parts, first descriptive evidence, and second we're going to talk about policy. So just to introduce you to this topic, we are more familiar, I think, in economics with product market concentration. So the idea of product market concentration is that you have a few companies that realize most of the sales. So for example, in the US, in mobile phones, there's only about 4 companies that essentially dominate the market. That's very, very tiny players, but 4 companies dominate the market. And similarly, the labor market, we're going to say, is concentrated when most jobs are held by just a few companies. And of course, we have to fix the type of job. Remember what I told you early on? We can't look at all jobs in general. We have to think a specific type of jobs. Well, how many companies are actually recruiting for that job? If there's very few companies, that means the labor market is highly concentrated. And economic theory predicts that product market concentration, the extreme being a monopoly, a single seller, leads to higher prices for consumers if you have a monopoly. For exactly the same reason, labor market concentration, in an extreme case monopsony, just one employer, leads to lower wages for workers, and in particular, workers end up being paid less than their marginal productivity, essentially less than their worth to production when you have a lack of competition among employers in the labor market. So to measure the state of competition in the labor market, we used the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which was used for the product market. And just to tell you how this is defined briefly, the way you do this is you fix a type of job, say accountants, and then you look at each firm that's active recruiting in accounting, and you calculate its share of jobs. So maybe firm A has 20% of jobs in accounting, so this would be a first share, and maybe there's just another firm B that has 80%. So you take the square of the share and you sum them up, and that gives you the Herfindahl index. So this index varies between 0. 0 is when essentially all the shares are close to 0. So if you have infinitely many firms, each firm's share is close to 0, so that's perfect competition. And we multiply by 10,000 to make it easier to read. 10,000 is monopsony. There's just one employer. So in an extreme case, the share is 1 square. The sum of 1 square is 1, so it's 10,000. If you have a perfect monopsony, just one firm that dominates the labor market. Okay, so why did we choose to measure the concentration this way? As I said, this is something that's been used for the product market, but also I'm going to put my policy hat. It's important for policy. So in the US, antitrust agencies look at horizontal mergers, meaning when two firms, let's say two mobile telecom firms, want to merge, if they are big ones, they have to be approved by the federal government before they can go forward and merge. And so the government, these federal agencies have guidelines regarding this index, and if the index is above 1,500, it's supposed to be that the market is moderately concentrated. Above 2,500, they talk about a highly concentrated market. So just to tell you what's 2,500, it's a market with 4 players with equal market shares that would lead to high concentration. Anything that's even more concentrated than this, let's say 2 players, that's even higher concentration, definitely high concentration. So then the rule is, if a merger increases the HHI by more than 200 points and it leads to a highly concentrated market, so therefore if after the merger of these 2 companies, we end up with a highly concentrated market, therefore an HHI above 2,500, then the merger is presumed likely to increase market power. It means that the Federal Antitrust Authority put a red flag. Bees, merger probably not going through, because you guys are entering, lack of competition territory with highly concentrated market. The important thing is that the guidelines say that this threshold of 2,500 applies also for buyers, and in particular, that includes employers. So therefore, in principle, if a merger between 2 companies leads to a highly concentrated labor market, that would also be a reason to stop the merger. So, however, even though that's true in the guidelines, practically speaking, there's been no merger so far that has been blocked in the US because of its anti-competitive effects in the labor market. But things are changing. The wind is turning. I testified at the Federal Trade Commission in October, and the chairman, Simon, said, we've told the staff that they're supposed to look at potential effects on the labor market with every merger that they review. So going forward, every US merger that is large, so they only look at large merger, will be scrutinized for potential adverse effects on the labor market. So all this work that I've done, as well as other colleagues who have found similar things, led to quite a bit of press. So for example, The Economist said, economists think antitrust policy should pay more attention to workers, and I think it's in the process of doing so, so I'm looking forward to see what will happen in the coming years. So now let's talk a little bit about the actual evidence behind this. So we have this paper where we try to measure labor market concentration. So really, how concentrated are labor markets in the US? So in this paper, we use data from Burning Glass Technologies from the year 2016. So Burning Glass Technologies is a private company that scrapes all the jobs on the internet in the US. So therefore, it has essentially all online jobs in the US, which, by the way, represents about 85% of all jobs in the US. So about, the rest is probably not advertised online. So essentially, we have almost all jobs in the US. Then we define a labor market by an occupation. Accountant and auditors would be an example. A commuting zone, so this is basically city area and all the suburbs that people commute from, and a quarter. And then we can, the reason why we calculated every quarter, remember that this is going to be based on job vacancies, it's based on job advertisements. We calculated every quarter because this is the average duration of unemployment in the US in 2016. So the thinking here is, if there is a job that is available in a year and you're currently unemployed, it's probably not relevant to you because most people find a job within the quarter. So that job, is not relevant to judge how much competition there is for work right now. And just as a reminder, I'm going to show you a map on the next slide. An HHI above 1,500 is deemed to be moderately concentrated, and above 2,500 is highly concentrated. So this is a map of the US showing you labor market concentration by commuting zone. For each commuting zone, we average labor market concentration by occupation. So the red is above 5,000, the orange is above 2,500. So anything orange or red is already highly concentrated, a lack of competition in the labor market. The yellow is moderately concentrated, and the green is like not concentrated, low concentration. So the pattern you see, if you're a bit familiar with the US, is that generally speaking, densely populated areas, like the East Coast corridor where I live, New York, Philadelphia, etc., tend to be low concentration, whereas more rural areas in the middle of the country are all very highly concentrated, right? So that's a little bit the geographic pattern that we have here. So just to give you some summary statistics, the average concentration is 4,400 almost. So it's way above, the level of high concentration. You can see the percentiles here. So overall, we have 60% of US labor markets that are highly concentrated. They're above the threshold that is deemed to be highly concentrated. And a further 11% of markets are moderately concentrated. Now, I've shown you in the map that these highly concentrated markets tend to find themselves in less densely populated areas. So you would expect that there's fewer people there. So another way to look at this is we can weigh by employment. So basically, in this second line, I'm showing you what share of US workers are working in highly concentrated markets. And the answer is 16%, which is a lower number than 60% because remember, low concentration areas or places like New York and LA, there's a lot of people in there. So whereas the high concentrated areas are, less densely populated. So this is two ways of looking at the data. I will say, for policy purposes, it's very important that there's a lot of highly concentrated markets because antitrust policy says that it's enough if a merger will adversely impact one market in order for the merger not to go through. So we're not going to trade off this versus that market. You have to exhibit a clear case of a labor market that is adversely affected in order to block the merger, and this should be easy to find since 60% of labor markets are highly concentrated. All right, so that was just to show you, the takeaway from this is most US labor markets are highly concentrated, suffer from a lack of competition among employers. Well, does this matter? So next up, I'm going to look at the impact of concentration on the wages that workers get paid. So in this other paper with Azar and Steinbaum, we again use data from careerbuilder.com, and we use the most common occupations. So this is only looking at the top 20, roughly, most common occupations. So keep that in mind because they are common, they're going to be relatively less concentrated. There's a lot of activity for recruiting in those occupations. So what we show, and this is just the raw data, is that the higher the concentration in a labor market, and the lower the wages that employers advertise on this platform. So there is a systematic negative correlation between the degree of labor market concentration and wages, And again, the intuition is the less employers compete for workers, and the lower wages the workers get paid. Now, this is a correlation, and we all know that this could be affected by many other variables. So in the paper, we go to great pain to try to account for all these other influences. So after controlling for many factors, we find that a 10% higher concentration is associated with about a 0.4% to a 1.5% decline in posted wages that employers are advertising on this website. All right. So that's one way to assess the degree of competition in the labor market. In this other paper that we have, we also measure labor market power in a different way. So we use the same data from Curribula.com. This is published in the AEA Papers and Proceedings. And as I said, we already have labor market concentration, I just discussed, which essentially represents for workers a lack of alternatives. There's not many other employers they could go to, or potentially collusion between employers. Because the fewer employers you have, the easier it is for employers to collude to keep wages down. So this is a reason why workers might be paid less than their marginal productivity. But labor market concentration is not the only reason in theory why you might expect workers to get paid less than their worth, so to speak. There are other reasons. These other reasons include job differentiation and imperfect information. So imperfect information is easy to see. Maybe there's another job out there that would be suitable for me, but I'm not aware. That gives more power to my employer to underpay me since I'm not aware of some of those other opportunities. Job differentiation is a little bit trickier, but also very important. So a key dimension of differentiation is geography. People prefer jobs that are close to their homes. Therefore, even though there might be other suitable jobs further away, the employers that are close by are able to pay workers less for the benefit of not having to commute so long. So this is one dimension. But there could be, of course, many other things. Workers might prefer jobs that are more flexible, jobs where the coworkers are nicer, whatnot. All jobs are different, and so the employers can exploit this preference of the workers in order to pay them less on account that the worker is getting other benefits from the job. So we can therefore measure this together with the labor supply elasticity. So the key idea here is that the less workers respond to wages in general, which could be for many reasons that I just discussed, and the easier it is for employers to exploit them. And by exploiting, I mean paying below marginal productivity, just to be exactly clear. So the less workers are interested in the wages versus anything else, and the more employers have the power to pay workers less, right? So that's sort of the key thing. So that's how we're going to measure, before I die, the labor supply elasticity, meaning how sensitive are workers to wages? To what extent do workers tend to apply to higher wages, or is the fact that the job pays more not a major reason for workers to go to that job? And what we're going to do is to proxy the labor supply elasticity with the application elasticity. So remember, we have data on applications, so I can ask, to what extent do workers tend to apply to higher wages when the wage is being increased, and I can compare that with concentration. So what we see here, just to cut straight to the chase, if you look at this, is that there is a correlation. So this is comparing now different markets. So in markets where labor market concentration is higher, meaning that there's just a few employers that recruit in those markets, these also tend to be markets where the application elasticity is low. So let me repeat. In markets where few employers compete for workers, where competition for workers is low, these are also markets where workers are not very sensitive to the wage, where paying a worker less will have a small effect on their probability of quitting. Okay, so there is a correlation, a strong correlation across markets between high concentration, low competition, and workers not being sensitive to wages very much, so that even if you pay them less, it doesn't increase their probability of quitting very much. So that's what this table shows. Next up, we can, and this is a descriptive regression, we can look at wages across different labor markets. And what this table shows you is that wages are higher in areas with higher elasticity. What does that mean? In areas where workers will easily quit if you pay them less, or will easily go to another employer if the other employer pays more, so that's high elasticity. Those are also the areas where wages are higher. Conversely, in areas with low elasticity, where workers are not very sensitive to wages, those are the areas where wage level is lower. And then you can include both the elasticity and the concentration, and both explain wages. So high elasticity, higher wages, that's what I just said, and this is kind of repeating our result from the prior paper. The higher the labor market concentration and the lower the wages that workers are paid. All right, so these kind of regressions that we just run are a little bit unsophisticated as far as econometric technique goes. I'm not going to go into that, but industrial organization, which is the study of pricing, usually in the product markets, has developed sophisticated techniques to better understand this lack of competition. So we have this new paper that's preliminary, we don't have a draft yet, where we use these more sophisticated techniques to try to measure the degree of labor market competition. So in this paper, we're going to explicitly model the demand for jobs or labor supply. Namely, understand what is it that decides the workers to apply to this particular job. So what we do is, again, we use this application data from careerbuilder.com and we focus on the largest markets. So we use nested logits. So what that means is we assume that workers first decide whether they want to apply to this occupation by commuting zone. So for example, I don't know, I'm a worker in New York. Do I want to apply to an accounting job in Philadelphia? Yes or no, depending on the expected benefit of me applying to this accounting job in Philadelphia. If I decide to apply, and that's the bottom level logit, I choose which particular accounting job in Philadelphia to apply to. So that's the second level. And ultimately, this model gives us, it's a structural model, it gives us an estimate of the utility of each job. So overall, taking all together, how valuable is this job to workers? And then I can ask the following question, which I'm going to show you in the next table. How do wages impact utility? Another way of putting this is, well, how much workers care about wages versus everything else that they care about in a job? So again, the question I'm asking is, how important are wages to explain a job's utility? And this is a table of results. I don't want to bore you with the technicalities, but this, if we focus on column 6, which is using an instrumental variable strategy to get a more robust estimate of the relationship between utility and wages. So I'm regressing, I'm explaining the worker's utility from a job as a function of the wage. And reassuringly, the higher the wages and the higher the utility is. Namely, workers care about wages, hopefully that's what you would find. But the magnitude matters. And so in these columns here, I convert, given some relationships we know from theory, I convert those estimated magnitudes to essentially how exploited workers are. And the answer here is about 18%. What does this 18% mean? It means that on average, and remember these are the biggest US labor markets, workers in these markets produce about 18% more than what they are paid. So again, this number here, the exploitation rate, means that on average, workers produce 18% more value than what they get in wages among those largest US labor markets. So that's what we can infer from our regression. And intuitively, the reason why we're able to do this is because we estimate how sensitive workers are to wages. So we use that to say, well, look, they are sensitive, but not infinitely sensitive. They're not going to switch job just for 1 cent more. And with that, we can infer how much employers are able to exploit them. And by exploit, I just mean pay less than their marginal product. And the answer is about 18%. So again, workers produce about 18% more than what they're paid in these largest US labor markets. We can also calculate the exploitation rate by occupation. These are a bit preliminary results, remember, but for example, we find that among our occupation, industrial engineers are the most exploited. They produce 40% more value than the wages that they get paid. Conversely, if you look at secretaries and administrative assistants, they are paid almost exactly their productivity. They produce only about 2% more than what they're paid. So there can be important differences by occupation with respect to the degree of exploitation, the degree of market power that employers are able to enjoy. All right, last topic is about the minimum wage. So that's the policy topic. So in this working paper, we look at the impact of the minimum wage on employment. A big concern is you put a minimum wage, that makes labor more expensive for companies, so maybe they will reduce their demand for laborers, aka employment will go down. So monopsony theory tells us that the employment effect of the minimum wage should be more positive in more concentrated markets. So let me tell you the intuition. If you have more concentration, remember from everything I've said before, that means you have more exploitation. And more exploitation means there's a bigger gap between the wages that workers are paid and their actual productivity. So therefore, wages can increase without hurting employment. The point is, if workers are really underpaid to start with, and then you raise the wage for the minimum wage, it's still worthwhile to employ the workers because they're producing so much more than what they're paid to start with. So in very highly concentrated markets where there's very little competition for workers, that means at the starting point, workers are really underpaid, so you can allow yourself to push up wages without losing employment. And so, again, employment can increase, in fact, in more concentrated markets after the minimum wage, because the minimum wage reduces the incentives for employers to keep employment low to suppress wages. So the way to think about this is without the minimum wage, maybe, let's say, extreme case, you have one employer, monopsony. There's just one employer in this market. What the employer does is it makes sure to keep the number of jobs low so that it can pay workers low wages. But now that you say, well, you can't pay workers low wages because we have a minimum wage, there's no longer an incentive to suppress employment. And therefore, employment can actually increase when you impose the minimum wage. So in this paper, and I'm just going to show you the last result on the next slide, we use burning glass data for labor market concentration and administrative data from the QCW on the employment level. And we're going to focus on an industry that has mostly minimum wage workers, which is retail. So the general merchandise stores, most of the workers that work in this industry are close to the minimum wage. So these are our results graphically. What we find is that in the less concentrated markets, less concentrated means a lot of competition. Markets where a lot of employers are trying to hire workers, the minimum wage has a negative and statistically significant employment effect. We're losing jobs when we increase the minimum wage in those markets where we are close to perfect competition, because in those markets, wages were already quite close to what the workers are worth. And then you make it even higher, that can make you lose jobs. In the medium concentration markets, there is no effect on employment. But in the high concentration markets, in markets where there's little competition for workers, where employers have a lot of market power to suppress wages, in those markets, putting a minimum wage actually significantly increases the level of employment in this industry. So depending on the level of competition in the labor market, the minimum wage can have a negative employment effect, no effect, or even a positive employment effect. So that explains why there is so much debate about the impact of the minimum wage on employment, because the effect could be very different depending on how much competition you have in your labor market. And if you aggregate the three, you can see that you're going to end up with an insignificant, zero-ish effect. So to conclude, big data shed new light on the functioning of the labor market and on policy impacts. And I have two main messages for you, is that job search matters. It is hard for workers to find a job, and jobs are very different. So jobs are highly differentiated. Job titles capture key differences between jobs. And from a policy perspective, we've seen that longer unemployment benefits increase unemployment mostly by postponing the increase in job applications around exhaustion. The second takeaway message is that the labor market, contrary to our assumptions that we tend to make, certainly among professional labor economists, is not competitive. The labor market is typically imperfectly competitive, so that typically workers get paid less than their marginal productivity. They get paid less than their worth. And so within this topic, we find that the majority of US labor markets are highly concentrated, so there's not a lot of competition. That higher concentration is associated with lower wages as well as a lower labor supply elasticity. That workers are about, and this is in the biggest markets, about 18% more productive than their wage level. And policy implication that the minimum wage employment effect depends on concentration. The effect of the minimum wage on employment will be positive in high concentration markets and negative in low concentration markets. All right, that's what I had for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ioanna, for your interesting presentation. And this shows a completely new lens to analyze the labor market. So I'm going to give you a little bit of insights regarding the Mexican labor market and the challenges faced based on what you just said. And well, first I want to say that big data allows researchers to understand labor market dynamics that cannot be approached through surveys or even administrative data. For example, from the Instituto Mexicano de Seguro Social or National Institute of Social Security. Second, my reflection is that we don't have maybe an online job board as large as careerbuilder.com or Burning Glass Technologies. So if we were interested in working something that similar to what you did, we would have to work with several job boards like ADECO, OCC Mundial, Boomerang, and even the National Employment Service from the Ministry of Labor. So it is very interesting to know that having a large job board, online job board, could facilitate the analysis of the labor market. We also don't have an employment insurance as they have it in France, like you presented. But the Mexican government have implemented several programs that affect the labor market. For example, Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, which give young people not working or studying the opportunity to work for a firm for 1 year period. Another program that is the one directed to youngsters studying beyond high school education. So what I think is that with big data, we could better understand the job search dynamic of the people benefited by these programs. Okay. Can you hear me? Sorry. Okay. Also with big data, we could also analyze the labor market defined by mobility, by commuter zones, and not only just defined by geographic zones. Also, I find really interesting to understand how concentrated is the Mexican labor market and how this has affected not only wages, but also we could analyze how it is affecting labor conditions or fringe benefits. And finally, I find really interesting your analysis on the effect of the increase in the minimum wage on employment, because the Mexican minimum wage has just increased. So what I think is we have a very interesting point of going beyond the analysis of the labor market that we have done in Mexico. So thank you very much. So I will proceed now with the questions that the public has.
Can I just briefly say?
Yes, of course.
Just to, these are all very interesting points. So for Mexico, I would be remiss not to shout out for people in the room who are doing this kind of research. So research on job boards in Mexico, Ray Campos here is working on that, doing a bunch of work trying to collate a data set of as many job ads as possible in Mexico. And if we're talking about concentration in Mexico, I don't remember your name, but there's a PhD student here, Christina, who is doing work on this in Mexico using employment data. So the thing is, one of the obstacles in Mexico is you have a lot of informal employment, and these kinds of informal jobs are not necessarily advertised online. So it's interesting to use instead a survey that is a census of employers that includes informal employers to try to get a handle on, you know, the players in every labor market, and that's what she's trying to do. So I think there's a lot of work, despite the limitations, that can be done in Mexico to push forward this agenda of understanding how a lack of competition in the labor market, well, how prevalent is it, and how important is it in understanding the impacts of various policies like the minimum wage.
Okay, thank you very much. Luis Felipe Perez asked, what is the impact on wages when you have competition for high-skilled jobs between high and low concentration areas?
So of course, the impact depends on worker mobility, and for high-skilled jobs, workers are probably more mobile. So this is why, you know, it's important to think about the option of a worker to apply in different markets. And in our paper that I was talking about, the one but last, we allow for that, because remember I said first the worker decides which market, which commuting zone to apply in, and then they decide what job to apply in. So thanks to this more complex analysis, you can see that even like industrial engineers, which are high skilled, can nevertheless be highly exploited on average, because presumably there's not a lot of relevant employers in that market, even after you account for the fact that potentially they could apply in different markets.
Regarding the concentration index, what happens when Walmart comes to town? Not a merger, not approved by FTC, but maybe government blogs or community blogs. What is the optimal here? What is optimal here?
That's a great question. So, you know, of course, as was mentioned, the antitrust agencies can only intervene when specific events happen, like a merger. So if Walmart comes to town, actually, there's been some work on this showing that, on average, it tends to slightly decrease labor market concentration because it provides another option for workers besides the local, you know, existing shops, but it also it does close down some of the shops. So on balance, it's still, on average, slightly improving opportunities for workers in these like more remote areas, but it also closes down shops. So it's a complex issue with respect to, you know, to what degree you want to encourage this. And so it really very much depends on the various costs and benefits that matter to the policymakers. So this is a complex issue. I also want to say just that a merger, you might think that this is crazy that a merger is blocked based on effects on a very tiny labor market. I do want to mention that you can have remedies. So the merger doesn't necessarily have to be blocked, but perhaps the owner, say if it's a store, has to sell that store to somebody else. So it's not necessarily that the merger can happen, but they have to make sure that it doesn't unduly increase concentration, and that's called divestiture, when we have to sell certain, you know, business units in order to avoid this, you know, concentration in the local market.
Okay, we have two questions from the Ministry of Labor. How sensitive is the market concentration index by economic sector? Mm-hmm. And the second one is, how is the market concentration related with firm revenues, workers' marginal productivity, and job loss due to, Roberto? Job loss due to, I don't understand it, I'm sorry. Automation. I'm sorry.
Automation.
Okay.
So,
okay, thank you.
This is all a complex question. The labor market concentration, so we didn't look at it by industry, but we looked at it by occupation. And there is a tendency for high-skilled occupations to be slightly more concentrated, but it's not systematic. So part of the reason you might think that high-skilled occupations are perhaps slightly more concentrated is because just think about it. These are very specialized jobs. So like how many companies employ, a director of data science in R, whatever, there might not be many companies like that, whereas many companies employ an administrative assistant. But that being said, there is a lot of variety, and you can have high concentration in high or low-skilled jobs. As with respect to automation, that's also a tricky question, but I think it's an area that is worth thinking more about. How does concentration impact automation? One thing I can say, and this is very speculative, is that to the degree that workers are underpaid already, that means that employers are making profit from employing workers. So there could be a silver lining with respect to automation. We're not as incentivized to automate, namely replace workers with capital, if we're already exploiting the workers a lot, because it's very profitable to employ workers. So in a way, it's that could be a sort of positive effect that if companies are able to make very high profits on workers, they are less incentivized to replace workers, with other things like capital and automate. But this is really very speculative, and this would have to be thought out more. I'm sure you could derive models that go one way or the other depending on the assumptions. So I'd encourage everybody here to think more about this issue.
Thank you. And another question. If words matter and firms compete to attract more efficient workers, what is the effect of job search algorithms on the description of the job, and what could its effects be?
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's a great question. So I'll respond a bit by a story, which is that, I've been talking with people working at careerbuilder.com. It's a business. And of course, they're trying to make the matching process as efficient as possible because, that's what employers want. They want to quickly find the right person. And one of the things that the business career builder has to contend with is to try to educate employers about what job titles they should put. And please don't use words that don't make sense to the workers, because you're not going to get the right workers if you advertise with the wrong words. So most big employers kind of know that, but it's not always the case, and they might say that we're looking for a Ninja Star guru. Well, what's a Ninja Star guru programmer? Please say Java programmer, or whatever it is that you're looking for. Don't use non-standardized, bizarre job titles, because that leads to you not being able to attract the right workers. Because remember, workers are using the words to decide what kind of job is appropriate. And I think one thing that the algorithms can do is to, either potentially transform the job titles to normalize them, or present both the job title that maybe the firm put with the normalized job title to help workers figure out what this job really is. And so the better we make the algorithms, this should really help workers and firms form better matches, be able to actually find the right employee for that particular job. But again, right now, the way that these search engines are structured, the first thing that workers see is the job title. So if the job title isn't chosen appropriately, it can lead to delays in the job being filled. So that's kind of an interesting issue when it comes to all these job boards. And it's something that might be also worth thinking about for the public job boards, to make sure that the companies advertise the jobs, in a way that is transparent, that helps workers, the right workers, apply to the job.
And the final question is, how is the exploitation rate differentiated by gender, race, or another characteristic?
That's a great question. So this is something that other people are working on, and I have to say that Joanne Robinson, who coined the term monopsony in the 1930s, one of the interests she had was to try to explain the gender pay gap. And her hypothesis was that maybe part of the reason why women get paid less is because they have lower labor supply elasticity, that they are not as mobile. So even if the employer next door pays more, they may not change jobs. And that allows their current employer to pay them less. So that was the assumption. So today, there's some research around that going on, but I'd say one difficulty is that we know that women actually have a higher labor supply elasticity than men, certainly when it comes to working or not working. So we know from research that when wages increase, women are much more likely to start working than men. So men kind of work no matter what the wage is. I mean, they try to find a high wage, but they tend to work. But women kind of move in and out of jobs to instead be at home, depending on the level of pay. So, but that's, so it's a complicated thing where, you have to consider that women, just because of traditional gender roles, especially when they're mothers, they have more options. There is the option employer A, employer B, or stay at home. And what I'm saying is that generally the findings are that women are very sensitive to wages when deciding to stay at home or work. So that's something that would limit exploitation. But on the other hand, maybe they're less sensitive to wages when it comes to choosing between employer A and B. And in fact, there is some research about women's employer choice. It's indirect, but it shows that when they become mothers or about to become mothers, they are much more likely to choose flexible jobs that pay less. So this is more about job differentiation, which means that women value certain job aspects besides the wage more. Therefore, they're willing to compromise on the wage in order to get those other job amenities like a flexible job. So I think, we need more research to understand, the many ways in which women's preferences and choices, as well as employer strategy, lead to gender pay gaps or different, exploitation rates by gender. By race, similarly, we might want to think more about those issues as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Ioanna. We have a diploma for you, so let's give her an applause.
Thanks.
Thank you.